The K-Thraxian Medical Center was having what Chief Medical Officer Vex'tara would describe as a perfectly normal day if your definition of normal included 3 plasma burns, a quantum radiation exposure, and a case of toxic spore inhalation. But for the galaxy's premier emergency care facility, it was indeed business as usual. That is, until Jack Murphy literally crashed through their front doors. "Heya folks," the human announced cheerfully, leaving a trail of red droplets as he limped toward the reception desk. "Don't suppose you could point me to the nearest first aid station?" The Zalaxian receptionist's 4 eyes widened in horror as she took in the sight before her. The human's right leg was bent at an angle that suggested an intimate acquaintance with the laws of physics had gone terribly wrong. A jagged piece of metal, presumably from his crashed shuttle, protruded from his abdomen like some kind of grotesque fashion accessory. And his left arm, well, she wasn't entirely sure where the rest of his left arm had gone. "Emergency code red," she screeched into the intercom, all 3 of her hearts racing. "Critical trauma in the lobby." Jack glanced down at himself and shrugged with his remaining shoulder. "Bit dramatic, isn't it? I just need some bandages and maybe a tetanus shot. Got a bit careless with the landing, you see. These magnetic storms are a real pain, and actually speaking of pain, you wouldn't happen to have any aspirin." Chief Medical Officer Vex'tara burst through the emergency bay doors, followed by a team of the station's top trauma specialists. She skidded to a halt, her bioluminescent patches flashing in distress as she processed the scene. "By the sacred nebula," she breathed. "How are you still conscious? How are you still standing?" "Oh," this Jack gestured vaguely at his various injuries. "Had worse during college rugby. Though I'll admit, the whole impaled by my own shuttle thing is a new one. Give it a solid 7 out of 10 for originality." Dr. Krill'ix, the center's leading expert in xenophysiology, was already scanning Jack with 3 different medical devices. "This is impossible," he muttered, his antennae twitching in agitation. "Your blood pressure you should be. These readings make no sense." "Speaking of blood pressure," Jack interjected, "I don't mean to be a bother, but I'm starting to feel a bit lightheaded. Don't suppose we could speed this up? Got a delivery schedule to keep." "A delivery, HFY," Courier Vex'tara's voice hit octaves previously unknown to science. "Yep, got a cargo hold full of premium Earth coffee beans that need to reach the Centauri colonies by Thursday. Can't let a little thing like massive trauma get in the way of customer satisfaction, right?" The medical team had finally snapped out of their shock and were attempting to guide Jack onto a hovering stretcher. He was proving surprisingly resistant to their efforts. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I really just need some basic first aid. Maybe a quick bone set, some stitches. Oh, and if you've got any of that fancy regeneration gel for the arm, that'd be great. Though I suppose I could just get a cybernetic replacement. Always thought those looked pretty cool." Dr. Krill'ix's professional composure finally cracked. "Basic first aid? Basic first aid? Your injuries would be fatal to literally any other known sentient species in the galaxy. The blood loss alone should have." "Oh yeah, about that," Jack interrupted, pulling a small device from his pocket. "Already took care of the blood loss. Universal donor, always carry a few spare pints in my emergency kit. Self-administered during the walk-over. Neat little invention, these portable transfusion units. Though I suppose I should get a new one, since this one's almost empty." The entire medical team stared at the casual way he held up the nearly drained container of his own blood, which he had apparently been using to keep himself alive while walking to the medical center with injuries that should have left him dead several times over. Vex'tara took a deep breath, her professional training finally reasserting itself. "Mr. Murphy, I must insist you allow us to treat you properly. Your injuries are severe, regardless of your remarkable constitution." Jack seemed to consider this for a moment, then checked his wrist computer, which was somehow still functioning despite being partially melted. "Well, I suppose I can spare a few hours, but I'll need to be out of here by morning to make my delivery window. Oh, and quick question, your insurance does cover humans, right? Because last time I needed medical attention in the Outer Rim." There was this whole thing about unprecedented biological resilience being a pre-existing condition. 3 hours later, Vex'tara was updating her medical logs while Jack chatted animatedly with the nursing staff, his newly regenerated arm already being used to gesture enthusiastically as he told them about this one time at space trucking school. Patient exhibited typical human physiological responses to severe trauma, she dictated, trying to keep her voice professional. "Including but not limited to inappropriate humor, complete disregard for personal safety, and an inexplicable fixation on completing work obligations while experiencing multiple life-threatening injuries. Treatment was successful, despite patients' repeated attempts to walk it off. She paused, then added, note for future reference, update medical center's definition of emergency to include separate protocols for human patients, who appear to operate on an entirely different scale of what constitutes a medical crisis. Also, stock more aspirin. Jack's voice carried from the recovery room, hey, since we're all done here, anyone want some coffee? I've got a whole cargo hold full of it, and I'm pretty sure one crate got dented in the crash anyway. Vex'tara terminated the log entry and rubbed her temple ridges. She had a feeling the human's brand of chaos would be providing teaching materials for the medical center's training programs for years to come. The next morning, right on schedule, Jack Murphy's repaired shuttle took off from the station's docking bay. As Vex'tara watched it disappear into the swirling magnetic storms that had caused the accident in the first place, she received a message on her personal communicator. Thanks for the patch-up. Left some coffee in the staff room. Fair warning though, it's the extra caffeinated kind. Figured you medical types could use the boost. Also, I might be back next week. Heard about a shortcut through an asteroid field that could shave 2 days off my regular route. What could go wrong? Jack. Vex'tara stared at the message for a long moment before sending a memo to all staff, begin preparations for establishing a dedicated human emergency protocol. And someone please research what it means. In the weeks that followed, the K-Thraxian Medical Center became known as the go-to facility for human emergency care in the sector. They developed a unique triage system that accounted for the bizarre human tendency to describe potentially fatal injuries as just a scratch. They stocked up on Earth-manufactured medical supplies, including an impressive array of adhesive bandages featuring something called dinosaurs. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to recognize the particular tone of voice that meant a human was about to do something incredibly dangerous while insisting they were totally fine and stationed security personnel near the exits, just in case. As for Jack, he did indeed find that asteroid field shortcut. The resulting incident involving 3 asteroids, a space pirate vessel, and what he described as a slight miscalculation with the gravity slingshot, led to the medical center's first official human incident response protocol, now standard training for all emergency care facilities in 5 sectors. The protocol's first rule? If a human says they're fine, they're probably not. If they admit they're hurt, call everyone. And somewhere in the staff break room, there's still a sign over the coffee maker that reads, warning, human-grade caffeine. Medical supervision required. No, seriously. We mean it this time. The legend of Jack Murphy only grew from there. The medical staff started keeping an unofficial Jack Murphy incident log, not to be confused with their official medical records, which were far less entertaining and contained significantly fewer exclamation points. One particularly memorable entry came 3 months after his first visit, when he casually strolled in with what he described as a minor case of rapid cellular degradation after flying through an unshielded quantum anomaly. He'd stopped by mainly because he was feeling a bit fuzzy around the edges and thought someone might want to take a quick look before his next delivery. Dr. Krill'ix nearly had an aneurysm when the scans showed Jack's molecular structure was literally coming apart. How are you not experiencing excruciating pain? He demanded, mandibles clicking in agitation. Oh, is that what that tingling sensation is? Jack mused, watching with mild interest as his hand briefly became transparent. Thought I might have just sat on it wrong during the landing. It took a week of intensive quantum stabilization therapy to put Jack's atoms back in proper order. He spent most of that time teaching the medical staff how to play something called poker and trying to convince the cafeteria staff to let him install an espresso machine. Then there was the small radiation incident that left him glowing in the dark for 2 weeks. Jack's primary concern had been whether it would affect his ability to do stealth deliveries. The whole bioluminescence thing is cool, and all he'd said, but it's hell on sneaking past space pirates. The pirates in question, as it turned out, had been trying to intercept his shipments of authentic Earth chocolate for months. They'd finally resorted to sabotaging a cargo transfer station with radioactive material, not realizing that humans were remarkably radiation resistant compared to most species, and Jack Murphy considered slightly radioactive to be more of an inconvenience than a crisis. He'd not only completed his delivery but had also managed to follow the pirates back to their base while literally glowing like a small sun. The pirates, upon seeing what they assumed was an angry radioactive ghost coming for revenge, promptly surrendered to the nearest authorities. Dr. Vex'tara had to create an entirely new section in the medical database just for unusual human biological responses to theoretically fatal conditions. Jack's contributions to medical science were, albeit unintentional, revolutionizing their understanding of xenobiology. He'd also revolutionized their coffee consumption, but that was a different matter entirely. One day, a young Arxian medical intern gathered up the courage to ask Jack why he kept taking such dangerous delivery routes. The human had been in for what he called a quick tune-up. After an encounter with some space debris that had left several microscopic holes in his pressure suit, and him during a particularly tricky bit of asteroid surfing. Jack's answer was pure human logic at its finest. Well, someone's got to do it, right? Plus, the pay's better for the risky routes, and I'm saving up to buy my nephew one of those fancy anti-grav skateboards for his birthday. Kid's gonna flip when he sees it. Speaking of flips, did I ever tell you about the time I had to do a manual barrel roll with a cargo hold full of artificial gravity generators? The medical staff had long since learned that Jack's stories, while sounding completely implausible, were usually true and often understated. The barrel roll incident, as it turned out, had involved him manually rotating his ship through a series of precisely timed movements, while the artificial gravity in both the ship and its cargo went haywire. He'd managed to save both his ship and the cargo, though the experience had left him with what he described as a slight case of being temporarily inside out. The medical center eventually created a special alert system just for Jack. Code Blue became known as normal human emergency, Code Red as human doing something inadvisable, and the rarely used Code Murphy, which meant Jack's got another brilliant idea and we need all hands on deck immediately. They also started keeping a supply of what Jack called the good stuff premium earth coffee in a special cabinet labeled for emergency use only. Yes, Jack, near-death experiences count as emergencies. It was a small price to pay for keeping their most interesting patients somewhat compliant with medical advice. 1 year after his first spectacular entrance, Jack threw the medical center a party. He'd somehow managed to import authentic Earth pizza, taught the entire staff how to play something called charades, and given everyone souvenir t-shirts that read "I survived treating a human patient" in glowing ink. Dr. Vex'tara, now sporting her own t-shirt and nursing her third cup of Earth coffee, had to admit that humans, or at least this particular human, had changed her entire perspective on medicine, physics, and the apparently very flexible nature of what constituted a survivable injury. As the party wound down, Jack was already talking about his next delivery route, something about a shortcut through a quantum filament storm that would probably be fine. Dr. Vex'tara just sighed and started preparing the Code Murphy protocols. At least life was never boring with humans around. The next day, as Jack's ship disappeared into the swirling chaos of the quantum storm, Dr. Krill'ix turned to Vex'tara and asked, "Do you think we should be worried?" Vex'tara took a long sip of her coffee and replied, "About Jack? No, about our sanity after dealing with humans? Absolutely." Somewhere in deep space, Jack Murphy was whistling as he piloted his ship through what most species would consider certain death, probably planning his next minor medical emergency. And in the K-Thraxian Medical Center, a team of dedicated professionals was updating their human treatment protocols, stocking up on band-aids, and wondering what impossible situation their favorite patient would survive next. After all, as the new saying went in galactic medical circles, if a human says they're fine, prepare for the worst. If they admit they need a band-aid, well, may the sacred nebulas have mercy on your souls. The quantum filament storm turned out to be exactly as dangerous as everyone except Jack had predicted. 3 days later, he limped his ship back to the medical center's docking bay, the hull looking like it had been chewed on by an angry space whale, which, as it happened, wasn't far from the truth. "Funny story," Jack announced as he walked into the emergency room, his skin flickering between different phases of matter. "Did you know quantum filaments can achieve pseudo-sentience under the right conditions? And that they really don't like coffee?" Dr. Vex'tara, who had been expecting something like this since the moment Jack mentioned the words quantum and shortcut in the same sentence, already had the quantum stabilization chamber warming up. "Let me guess you tried to bribe them with your cargo." "More like they tried to sample it without asking," Jack chuckled, watching with mild interest as his left hand temporarily existed in 3 different dimensions at once. "But hey, bright side, I discovered that quantum-infused coffee makes a great emergency fuel source. Wrote a paper about it during the ride back. Thinking of calling it Murphy's Law of Caffeinated Physics." The medical staff had long since learned to roll with Jack's particular brand of chaos. While they worked to reintegrate his scattered quantum signature, He regaled them with the full story complete with sound effects and multiple demonstrations of how he'd surfed a wave of quantum energy using his ship's coffee-powered emergency thrusters. And that's when I realized, he concluded, as Dr. Krill'ix carefully adjusted the quantum harmonizer, that if you play classical music at just the right frequency, quantum filaments will actually dance. Got it all on video too, though it might be a bit hard to watch since I was partially existing in the fourth dimension at the time. The video, when they finally saw it, looked like someone had given a kaleidoscope a seizure. But there, in between frames of reality-bending chaos, you could indeed see massive streams of quantum energy moving in perfect rhythm to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. By the time Jack was back to existing in a single dimension and timeline, he'd already planned his next delivery route, this one through something called the parallel probability maze. Jack, Dr. Vex'tara said, with the patience of someone who had long since accepted their fate as the medical guardian of an impossibly resilient human, you do realize that, technically speaking, you've died 17 times in the past hour alone. Only 17. Jack looked genuinely surprised. Must be getting better at this. Last time I quantum surfed, I hit at least 30 temporal deaths, though I suppose that depends on which timeline you're counting from. The medical center eventually added a new wing specifically for treating quantum-related injuries, unofficially dubbed Murphy's Ward. The sign outside read, "For when reality takes a coffee break." As Jack prepared for his next adventure, he left the medical staff with one final gift: a coffee machine that supposedly existed in all possible quantum states simultaneously, guaranteeing the perfect cup of coffee in any reality. The instruction manual was written in 17 dimensions and came with a warning label that read, "Caution, side effects may include temporary omniscience, spontaneous reality shifts, and an inexplicable craving for quantum donuts." Dr. Vex'tara kept it in her office, next to a framed copy of Jack's first medical scan and a sign that read, "In case of human, break physics." And so the legend of Jack Murphy continued to grow throughout the galaxy. Space pirates told stories about the glowing human who couldn't die. Quantum physicists studied his coffee-powered achievements with equal parts horror and admiration. Medical students were now required to take a course called Human Resilience 101 when walking it off defies known science. But perhaps the most telling testament to Jack's impact was the new emergency classification system adopted by medical facilities across the galaxy. It went something like this: Level 1 standard emergency, Level 2 severe emergency, Level 3 critical emergency, Level 4 human emergency, Level 5 Jack Murphy. The final entry in the unofficial Jack Murphy incident log simply read, "Note to all medical personnel, if a human courier arrives asking for a band-aid, evacuate the sector. Unless it's Jack Murphy, in which case, put on some coffee and enjoy the show." And somewhere out in the vast expanse of space, Jack Murphy continued his deliveries, casually defying death, physics, and common sense, one impossible survival story at a time. After all, those quantum donuts weren't going to deliver themselves.